Good afternoon, folks, on this beautiful Sunday. At least it's beautiful where I'm at, here in Virginia. I'm just going to stop promising you that the next video is going to be about ethics, because I keep coming up with material to talk about of a metaphysical nature. So we'll get there when we get there, okay? Let's just put it that way. This video will be kind of a setup for explaining how this relates to Jorjani's philosophy. It's going to be less about Jorjani than it is about a millennia-long dispute, metaphysical dispute between the Roman Catholic West and the Eastern Orthodox East within Christendom. Because I think it's very instructive for metaphysics in general and for philosophy in general. I'm not really interested in its Christian context at this point, but it is, I think, very relevant and very instructive for interacting with the thought of Dr. Jorjani. So, remember that I just talked about the fact, I addressed Jorjani's objection to a God that knows the end from the beginning. Because, as Jorjani rightly notes, a God who knows everything in advance has determined everything in advance. It is inconsistent to espouse free will while espousing the notion that God foreknows everything in advance. And that is because that idea takes place within the overall metaphysical dualism of these different systems, be it perennialism, Dharma, Christianity, or Plato. Because Plato, more or less, in one way or another, influences all of these systems. Dharma is different, but there's still that fundamental duality between the oneness without difference, the monism, from which emerges dualism. Not just the dualism inherent within creation itself, but that emergence creates a dualism between the dualistic realm down here and the monistic realm from which the manifest realm or dual realm emerges. And I've talked about how the tantric philosophy is a vast improvement on Advaita Vedanta, another school within Orthodox Vedism, but even it falls short because it thinks that we need to be reabsorbed into the one, that somehow non-duality implies that differentiation can only be a temporary state of affairs for the one who is being self-realized, and by the time we get self-realized, then there can no longer be difference. But I don't want to get too far afield. Another thing we talked about with regard to free will and determinism is that if God knows the end from the beginning, far from being God, it would make God finite and therefore not God. Because it would mean, if he knew all things exhaustively, it means there would be a finite amount of information for God to know, which means that of necessity his creation would have to be finite. And if his creation is finite by necessity, that requires there be a fundamental separation between God and the world, a la the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing, per Christianity, as just an example. But if non-duality is true, then creation doesn't have to be finite. God is more than what he creates, but he is also what he creates. The creation is the embodiment of God's consciousness. Or I should say the corporealization of God's consciousness. And therefore, there is no separation, and therefore creation itself can be infinite and eternal. Infinite in the sense of going on forever in all directions. Therefore, there's nothing that happens, even though God doesn't foresee all things. Nothing happens outside of his purview, because when individuated instantiations of his creation deliberate and make certain decisions or take certain actions, they are the individual instantiations of divinity doing those things, and therefore God is acting at all times and in all places. So nothing happens outside of his awareness or activity. And so that leads me to this dialogue that has gone on forever between the West and the East within the Christian tradition over what the East calls the essence-energy distinction, and the position taken by the Catholic Church per Thomas Aquinas, which is called by the Latin phrase Actus Purus, or pure act. So I'm gonna greatly simplify what that debate is, but I will be nevertheless portraying it accurately. So pure act basically means that God, in the context of the debate, means that God is what he does, and he does what he is. So God is being pure act. There is no distinction, no eternal distinction between the essence of God and his activity. Whereas for the East, the essence-energy distinction is fundamental. There is an eternal, not separation, but an eternal distinction between what God is and what God does. And I think it's instructive for our conversation here, because from what I have read so far in Jorjani's work, and from what I have heard in listening to his interviews, he doesn't spend any time really thinking about that or discussing that, assuming he's even aware of it. But as a philosopher, I would think he is aware of it on some level. But he's so fixated, so obsessed with, rightly, I'm not criticizing him, with deconstructing and correcting the subject-object dualism of Plato, René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, Christianity, and so on, that all of his energy is focused on demonstrating that his spectral substance is the answer to the duality between Plato's eternal ideas and their shadows and copies on Earth. So he has a spectral substance, or what he calls an imaginal substance, that we discussed in the first part, or first two parts of this series, where everything exists along a spectrum, and everything has a degree of sensuousness, whether that be a thought in my mind or an object laying out on the street somewhere. Whether it be a physical object or a thought, a quote-unquote abstract thought, they all exist along this this sensual spectrum that he calls his basically super substance, or super spectral substance, right? But he spends so much of his energy on that although he does not explicitly use the phrase Actus Purus, the way he talks about the eternal flux of Heraclitus, it sounds like Actus Purus, that's the position he's taking, that although he doesn't believe in God, so we'll leave the word God out of it. He basically believes that Heraclitus flux is just pure activity. It's just this holomorphic or helomorphic substance in constant eternal motion. So it's basically Aquinas without the God talk. And that is where my, I guess we'll go ahead and go there. So that is what my big criticism is of Jorjani's thought. Once you reduce this whole question to Actus Purus, you have essentially taken a monistic position, even though Jorjani nonetheless decries monism, just as he decries dualism. He thinks that he solves the problem of monism by affirming that he has a principle of ontological unity, whereby the thing uniting individual forms with the substance out of which those forms emerge is just this dynamic tension that exists between them. The problem is that everything reduces to the substance alone and to pure act. This subject, just this flux, just constantly rotating, and as he puts it, spinning out the forms in their corporealized state. And so without using the word God, let's just say the flux. If the flux just is what it does, and it simply does what it is, there being therefore no eternal distinction between the two. What allows for that what allows for the flux to suddenly create the distinction between its own infinitude and the finitude of all that it manifests. So you'll recall that I have made this distinction before. Yeah, let me step back now and explain what I've said at different points along the way, but I want to try to bring it into a more condensed, brief discussion right here. My position relative to the debate between, say, the J. Dyers, who represent the Eastern Orthodox position, and the traditional Roman Catholic / Thomas, Aquinian view of Actus, pure God as pure act. Let me define my position relative to that. So, as a non-dualist, I don't believe that there is a separation between creation and God. I completely, utterly reject creation out of nothing. So in a very, very real sense, everything is God and God is everything. But I would also denounce in solidarity with the Eastern Orthodox position, I would condemn an Actus Purus understanding of non-duality. The distinction, in my mind, between God, the creator, or God, the source of all the source of the manifest, the source of the realm of duality. The difference is best, perhaps in this context, analogous, best described as analogous to the Christian view of the Father as the eternal cause of the other two persons within the Trinity, the Father and the Holy Spirit. So there they say that the Father is the cause, but nevertheless, the three persons are eternal, because the nature of that causation is an eternal causation, which they distinguish from the universe. They would say that that is not an eternal causation, but rather I don't know if they would call it a temporal causation. That would be maybe the wrong way of putting it, but they see a fundamental distinction between causation within the Trinity and God's creation. So what my non-dual philosophy teaches, what it says, is that the nature of the non-separation between God and creation is analogous to the eternal relationship that is shared between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. So creation itself is eternally caused by God. The manifest is eternally caused by God. So that's how you can maintain a distinction between the Creator and what he manifests, she manifests, while maintaining a non-dual perspective on God being what he creates. So, to take that one step further, the difference between God and creation, then, from a non-dual standpoint, is not that they are two different substances, not that they are separate in that sense, not that God created everything out of nothing. The fundamental difference between God and the world is that God, as creator, is infinite in terms of his awareness, knowledge and awareness. And so God is fully and completely each and every individual instantiation of the manifest realm. But the individual instantiations are not the totality of God in terms of their knowledge and experience. In other words, God, while maintaining the totality of the knowledge of all things, since he brings it into being, and knowing precisely what it is to be every individual instance of that which he manifests, since he descends into the finite to experience reality as that finite being, as that finite thing. It is not the case that the reverse is true, that that individuated thing comprehends the totality of God's awareness or knowledge, or experiences it. So I wanted to lay that out very methodically so that we're all on the same page. So how would I stand then relative to the debate between the East and the West? So I guess I would say that this extra step, creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo, that is such a staple of the Christian faith, it is an unnecessary extra step. You can eliminate that and apply the logic of eternal causality that the church uses to describe the eternal cause of the Trinity by the Father, and apply that to the universe and everything in it as a whole. And that is how you maintain the recognition. That's how you are able to affirm that everything is God, while also acknowledging that there is a fundamental distinction between God as creator and God as the things he creates. And I believe Jorjani ultimately falls into the Actus Purus trap by ultimately reducing activity to substance, which is his helomorphic third substance of Giordano Bruno. And by not maintaining the distinction between substance or essence and energy / activity, he therefore is unable to explain how the substance is able to, he can't account for how this radically monistic pure substance, since there's no fundamental primordial distinction between substance and act or activity, he's unable to account for the corporealization or manifestation of all that is. That's really the best way I can put that. All right, I'm going to upload this now.